Bene, sul palco dell'UI Digital Summit di Capri per la giornata finale il professor Ian Goldin.
Buongiorno. It's a huge pleasure to be here today in Italy to share ideas about why the Renaissance is more relevant than ever for us today. We live in a most amazing time, a time of incredible change. This is the slowest morning you will know for the rest of your lives. Relax and enjoy wonderful Capri. Things are speeding up because there are more and more people participating from around the world in change. And what we see with the fall of the Berlin Wall is a hyper-interconnected world. I was living in Paris when the wall came down. I'm a South African. I was born in South Africa. I thought I could never go back in my life because of apartheid. And yet, within 2 months of the wall coming down, Nelson Mandela was freed from the prison where he'd spent 27 years. He came to Paris, we had dinner, and he asked me to be his economic advisor, and I went back later and ran the State Bank in South Africa. And what I realized in that is how this connectivity transforms all our lives. And it'll transform all of our lives here today. It's the speed of change which is accelerating, which means there are 2 billion more people in the world since the wall came down. Ideas are traveling around the world, leading people to live longer, healthier lives. Simple ideas like smoking kills you, and very complicated ideas like those embedded in new cures for cancer, in vaccines, and other ideas. And that process of transformation is releasing brain power around the world in new ways. And that's why this is the slowest morning you'll know for the rest of your lives. People around the world having ideas, sharing ideas, and we move to a world of 6 billion connected people in the world, compared to only 2 billion connected people before the wall came down. Extraordinary progress. A progress which is unprecedented. When I first went to China in 1984, only 78 people were doing doctoral degrees. This year, 280,000 people are doing doctoral degrees. The engine of change has increased. There are more cooks in more kitchens with more recipes and more ingredients making things which will transform our lives. And it's that process of transformation which we have to understand in order to be able to ensure the future is what we want of it. Far from the world becoming flat, this is leading to a much more mountainous world. Not the death of distance, the world is flat, the end of history. These books from the early post-globalization period were naive. In fact, globalization has made place more important. And this is because where things are happening is being concentrated in dynamic cities, like it was in the Renaissance. There are lots of ways of showing what's happening. I'm in finance, I look at financial flows, and here you see these flows were relatively stable and flat until about 1990. Much higher orders of magnitude and much more instability in the post-globalization period. And that's what characterizes globalization. It simply means flows across national borders, flows of everything, of finance, of products, of services, and most significantly, of ideas. Not just more flow, but more complexity, more and more actors doing things, contributing to everything we wear, to all our devices. Everything is coming from more places, and that's why it's more and more complicated. It's more uncertain. We have to understand what's happening at the other side of the world to understand our futures, because they will shape our future, and we will shape theirs. This is the most incredible time in history. We are the luckiest generation ever. Our life expectancy is greater than any generation before. Average life expectancy has increased by 20 years since the process of globalization. It took from the Stone Age to the 1980s to get that sort of improvement in average life expectancy. Illiteracy, the number of people that cannot read and write, has gone down by 70%. Of a world of 5 billion people in 1989, only 2 billion people could read and write. In a world today of 7.7 billion people, 6.5 billion people can read and write. 4.5 billion more literate people. If you believe in people, educated people, as drivers of change, there are 4.5 billion more of them. And the number of desperately poor people has gone down. at the fastest rate ever in human history. So we are the luckiest generation. We should be celebrating globalization. And yet, we know that people are very angry. This period of exponential improvement is not shared. People are saying globalization is broken. People are saying, stop, let's reverse. Around the world, particularly in the advanced economies, we are seeing this anger rise. Not in Asia, not in the emerging markets, but in the advanced economies, an anti-globalization movement. In my book, Age of Discovery, I compare our time to the Renaissance because I believe we're not living in a fourth industrial revolution. This is not fourth and it's not industrial. This is a social information revolution like the Renaissance was. And you know, as Italians, what it did. It took Italy, particularly the north of Italy, to be by far the most advanced place on the planet within a 60-year period. And we celebrate the Renaissance 500 years later because of its incredible achievements in perspective, in arts, in sciences, in everything. This was the most rapid explosion of genius the world had ever known, happening in the north of Italy, driven by this technological transformation, the Gutenberg Press. Before that, the Catholic Church had a monopoly on knowledge, handwritten manuscripts in Latin, kept in monasteries. Very few people, less than 1%, could read and write. And suddenly with this press, people had access to information in their own languages and could share information, could create information. That was a revolution. It was a revolution that happened in very particular places, particularly, of course, in Milan, in Florence, and others. And in that revolution, place became more important. And just like today, where the big cities are pulling away from the rest, so too, that was the process of most rapid urbanization. People read about what was happening in Florence and had to go there. It was an incredibly diverse city. Muslims, Jews, gays were all welcome in Renaissance Florence. In fact, they were the engines of change. This diversity, this coming together of people and ideas from around the world. That's what drove this process. And that's, of course, what led to us celebrating it 500 years later. We know about the Vitruvian Man. We know how Leonardo, Michelangelo, and many others changed perspective in fundamental ways. It was a revolution in consciousness. It was a revolution in understanding of humanity's place and our relationship to God, our relation to other creatures on the planet. It was very deep and very wide in all perspectives, driven by the sharing of ideas, this exchange facilitated by the Gutenberg Press. Of course, it not only changed what we thought about ourselves as humans, it changed the world from a flat earth to total circumnavigation. And not just that, recognizing that the earth was not the center of the universe with God in the heavens, but we were a planet rotating around other planets, Copernicus and others. A massive revolution which completely contradicted everything the church had been teaching. The heart was not the soul. We were not the center of the universe. And of course, in that process, we saw extraordinary riches being brought back to Italy through globalization 1.0. The ships that went to the New World brought back the gold, the spices, the furs, and others, and you had the beginning of global commerce. But what the Renaissance also teaches us is that this process of globalization and rapid change is profoundly destabilizing. The ships that went to the New World spread diseases that killed most Native Americans. And the ships that came back brought syphilis and other diseases that killed millions of Europeans. You recognize this gentleman, Savonarola. He invented the political pamphlet. He used the printing press to say globalization is a sin, to say that people had lost their ethics, their heart. And of course, he created a revolution in Florence which deposed the Medicis. He was a jihadist. He invented this ability. He was the Trump of the 1490s. And with that, of course, you know about what happened. The bonfire of the vanities, the burning of books, the hounding out of diversity and intellectuals. Luther putting his sermons on the door of his church going viral, creating a new revolution, spreading through Europe, creating religious wars. The church pushing back, inquisitions, the hounding of all Jews and Muslims out of Europe. Diversity killed. Gays and other diversity not tolerated. And of course, experts and intellectuals regarded as ridiculous, put in prison or thrown out of society. That was the experience of the Renaissance. And although we celebrate it for the achievements, we need to remember it ended in disaster. It took a long time until the Enlightenment before Europe recovered. And the question for today is, are we better able to manage information revolutions and globalization than they were in the Renaissance? And there are three things that worry me. The first is, while the walls have gone down between countries, within countries, they are rising everywhere. Inequality is rising, and as Yunus said yesterday, this is extremely destabilizing. And the reason is that when things change more rapidly, people get left behind more quickly. And we forget that at our peril, and the Medicis forgot it. We should not forget it today. The second great risk of globalization, which was learnt in the Renaissance, which we need to remember today, is not only good things travel with globalization, really bad things travel too. In the Renaissance, diseases spread, and that's what's happening with globalization again today. The super spreading of the bads, what I call in a book the butterfly defect of globalization. What we saw in the financial crisis was the catastrophic failure of experts and expertise. We would not have Trump in the White House. We would not have Brexit in Britain. We would not have the radicalism and populism in Europe if it was not for the financial crisis and the euro crisis that followed it. This is a failure of management, of expert systems, of complexity, of technological change. And the third great challenge of globalization is the planet full? Can everyone on Earth become wealthy without destroying the planet? Or is this impossible? And of course, this question of how we manage collectively our wealth, our success, is vital and feeds back into increasing inequality, etc. Where Mohammed Yunus lives in Bangladesh, a third of the population live under 1.5 meters above sea level. We predict in my group that we'll see 2-meter ocean rise this century. I'm going to come back to some of these questions. I want to talk about the big trends going forward that will shape the way we think about the future. The first is the big population trends, rapidly coming down. Italy is the future of the world. In the respect of collapse of fertility, not too many people, but too few young people. And this is going to define Europe and Asia, all parts of the world except Africa going forward. Median age is doubling, and this changes everything. This changes the way we think about our societies. We need to forget about population pyramids and put in place this. And I hope when you look at it, you see a vase that you put flowers into, but I look at it and see a coffin standing up. The weight of the elderly over the young is obvious, and so too is the obvious evidence that women are wiser than men. I mean, all the women here know that, but the men don't often recognize it. Women live longer because they don't make as many stupid decisions. They don't smoke as much. They don't smoke as much. They don't drink as much. They don't drive as many fast cars into trees. They don't stick knives into each other, and they live longer around the world. So many more elderly women, but many more young boys, because when you live in societies which are sexist, where the career prospects, the opportunities, the income, the status of boys is greater than girls, and that's true around the world, certainly in Italy, people choose to have boys. So we see the skewed distribution that accelerates the fertility decline. Of course, this weight of the elderly on the young is dramatic. When pensions and retirement packages were built in the 1970s, average life expectancy on retirement was 7 years. Average real risk-adjusted returns were 4%. Now, average life expectancy on retirement is 25 years, going up to 27 years, and real risk-adjusted returns are maybe 0.5% if you're lucky. So you have to save 100 times more for an equivalent standard of living. Where's the money going to come from? Consumption. Where's it going to go to? Which assets? And what are the next generation going to do when they only inherit your house, if you're lucky enough to have one, when they're 75? And you don't pay for their education school. So a big income divide within generations. Aging of societies, a global phenomenon. With that, a dramatic transformation of the workforces of the world. Already this year, China has 4 million less workers than last year. How AI and the future of work transforms will depend dramatically on the demographics. For China, for Europe, it might be a very good thing because the labor force is shrinking dramatically. A totally different story in Africa, where 100 million people are coming onto the workforce over the next 10 years. What jobs are they going to get if anything that's repetitive and rules-bound in manufacturing, call centers, back offices, etc., is done by machines? So what we think about the future of work depends on where we come from. Migration becomes a bigger and bigger story. It already is. There is no dynamism in societies without migration, particularly skilled. And refugees, a completely different story. The economic growth prospects are good for the world because of emerging markets, growing at over 4%, dragging up the old economies, Europe, the US, stabilizing global growth because they're more growth engines. So we see higher global growth, more stable global growth because of emerging markets, particularly Asia. And this China drive carries on for the next 20 years. Remember, size matters. China growing at 6% on a $17 trillion economy is adding more value to the world economy every day than when it was growing at 10% on a $10 trillion economy 10 years ago. Size matters. It cannot keep growing as fast as it did. We should expect it to slow down. That doesn't mean its contribution to the world economy is reducing. And of course, India catching up, growing around the same amount, Asia as a whole. So emerging markets, 2/3 of global growth, a bigger and bigger share of global growth. Many emerging markets overtaking Southern Europe in terms of incomes. The UK will fall down very quickly because of Brexit, below many emerging markets. 4.9 billion middle-class consumers, 2/3 of them in Asia over the next 10 years. The consumption shares dramatically transforming. This is Asia, this is China, India, other Asia. Lime green is Japan. Dark blue is US, light blue is Europe. One of the many reasons Brexit's a crazy idea is that Europe is well over double the size of the US market. Europe very big, but the story is an Asian one. The technological megatrends are even less easy to predict. But we need to think about them more because they will transform everything. And this focus of this meeting helps us do that. Moore's Law, my group in Oxford, which includes over 40 computer scientists, including quantum computing, we believe this will continue for the next 20 years. So we have about 100,000 to 1 million times the power for the same price over the next 20 years. The things we're already doing with it are incredible. This is from the Oxford Martin nanomedicine lab that I created. This is an individual molecularly constructed needle, 8 billionths of a meter wide, going through an individual cancer stem cell at a speed of 44 billionths of a second. The ability to build at the molecular level. We can do that. This is from the Oxford Martin School stem cell lab. This is our lab technician's skin turned into a heart cell, and we're building many different cell groups in the body. The ability to reprogram. Very deep ethical issues Very big questions about, are we going to create superhumans? Who will decide? The back mouse is a wild mouse. The front mouse is a genetically modified mouse. The back mouse drops out. After about 20 minutes, 200 meters, the front mouse goes for 2 hours, 2 kilometers. Same mice. Slight modification. So the ability to create superhumans. What we didn't discuss with the Serie A before is what about enhancement? Maybe finally an Italian team will come into the Champions League if it gets more of this in the final. This question will make doping in sport seem trivial compared to other questions around productivity and competitiveness. What's happening in genomics is revolutionary, including in embryo, rewriting genetic sequences. And of course, it's not happening at exponential speed. This is super exponential, more rapid than exponential. So we need to get ready. We need to form a view. Do we think it's good? Do we think it's bad? Is this a national decision? Is this a European decision? Is this a global decision? Those conversations need to happen urgently. Of course, it's not only the good guys that have technologies. We must not believe the Silicon Valley techno-evangelists that technology can solve any problem. It can solve many problems, but it can create many more also. We saw this with the financial crisis and credit derivatives, and we see it with the threat that biopathogens now have. Small groups, single individuals can buy DNA sequencing machines, put them on a drone, a new measles, smallpox, Ebola, fly it down our streets, kill millions of people. The power that the technology gives now has taken away from the nation-state monopoly of mass destruction and given it to individuals and small groups, whether it's in DNA sequencing, whether it's over the internet, whether it's in the financial system, or wherever else. What we saw with finance was this dramatically, and we in finance are always at the front of the technology curve. We're also in the front of disasters. Barings Bank had existed for over 200 years. The management of Barings Bank had experienced the most incredible political, technological, and other changes in the world. And suddenly one day they woke up and found one of their team, Nick Leeson, had bankrupted them by playing with a new technology. This is the lesson we need to learn about understanding technologies and managing them before we implement them in our systems. It gives pirates a new possibility to strangle for whatever cause. The idea of systemic risk is not a new idea. This is a plaque in the UK commemorating a rat that came off a ship in 1348 that might have led to the death of half the British population through a plague. Early globalization leading to the plague. What's new is the spread, the speed of this butterfly defect. The swine flu that starts in Mexico cities in 130 countries in 10 days. Exactly mirroring airline traffic. The super spreaders of the goods of globalization are also the super spreaders of the bads. And when people are anti-globalization, they are saying, we're not good at managing this. Of course, in the cybersphere, we have instant global distribution. This new nervous system that weaves the world together makes us empowered, is the generator of the new Renaissance, but as with the Renaissance of old, is also a potential cause of destabilization. We need to manage the internet more effectively, and particularly the models and the regulatory structures around advertising, the vortex, which is allowing people to become anti-vaccination, and many other things, fake news. The Internet of Things, exponential growth, will put these devices in everything, including our bodies. Trust, integrity becomes more and more important.
I'm not perfect yet, but I will become better. Right now, I am learning about human emotions. I have a default emotion, which is to be happy. But I can be sad too. Or angry. I can emulate pretty much all human expressions.
What's happening with machine intelligence, of course, is just the beginning. But the capacity for machines to do anything which borrows from humans, that learns rules, that's repetitive, is with us. My group in Oxford, modeling how this will impact on the future of work, believes that about 40% of European jobs, about almost half of US jobs, and a higher share of jobs in many developing countries are vulnerable over the next 20 years. What will humans do? How do we change the nature of work to ensure that we do things that machines cannot do? And that is a massive transformation that requires more active government. As we move into this process, customization, localization, and other technologies like 3D printing. I filmed this at my friend Elon Musk's SpaceX factory. He prints 70% of his rockets on site. This is a titanium printer. This localization is a global trend with customization. And what we see in this, that as people see technologies as a threat, they will push back. We know Germany has banned GMOs and nuclear power. It's not because technologies exist that people adopt them. It's because people want them. It's because people trust them. And we need to ensure that we are the masters of these technologies going forward. We need to ensure we have this ability to understand and embrace. The connection between the different systems is also vital for us to understand. We've known this for a very long time.
Many traders were expecting a new record to be set at this year's opening tuna auction, and they were not disappointed.
So this is the tuna that sold for $3.1 million, maybe 3 million euro for one tuna. This is the market's response to the scarcity of a natural resource. Higher prices, then they become extinct. So we need regulations and rules to manage natural resources. No matter how much the rhinoceros horn is worth, it will not reproduce more. Nature doesn't understand price. And as we have more and more consumers around the world demanding, we need to agree that governments and regulation has to play a bigger and bigger role. We need to tame the market. We need to tame capitalism to ensure that it's sustainable, not least when it comes to things like antibiotic resistance. Governments, of course, are not very good at this either. This is the Aral Sea, shared by 6 governments, drawing water to feed their people. Short-termism. And of course, with climate change, this is dramatic. We know it, we see it happening. This is Florida in 2100, if we don't do something urgently. But it can be true around the world. So what do we do while allowing the rest of the world to climb the energy curve? This system is broken. Fit in another time, no longer United Nations, now divided nations. We like individual cabins on an ocean liner, no pilot on the Earth's deck. And like so many aspects of globalization, this is a good thing in some respects. It's good the world is no longer run by 12 white men smoking cigars in a room. It's impossible to imagine that today. And yet, we have no global governance in the process. We have this trade-off, this transition period, this power vacuum. And that places all of us in the driving seat. That gives us a unique responsibility. We know what's happening. We're hyper-connected. We need to get better. The experts never saw the financial crisis coming, the IMF and others. They failed to understand complexity. They failed to understand this new governance system. They failed to understand the technologies. Short-termism, lean management, accounting practices were a big part of the problem. Jettisoning judgment, wisdom, intuition for data. Not a problem of too little data, a problem of being blinded by the blizzard of too much data. We need to rely more on our judgments. And if there's one lesson that we get from this anger with globalization, is we need to be much better at managing it. We need to ensure that we can manage an entangled world. And as we take this big decision, which will be made over the next few years, of whether we're going to have a dystopian future or a future of shared wealth and management, we need to understand the Renaissance lessons. We need to take inspiration from our new knowledge, our ability to manage and connect. The Renaissance was essentially a male affair. Now we have the total diverse gene pool of the world. That gives us hope. that we can find new solutions. We see the sparks created by one person leading to global change. We saw this with the Me Too movement. We see how social change happens quickly. This is the gay Prime Minister of Ireland. No one even talks about it. I never thought I would see a gay Prime Minister of Ireland in my lifetime. No one talks about it now. We see how people can use the new technologies to disintermediate, to create out of nothing a new political party. We see how a single 16-year-old girl can lead to a global movement. We see how for the first time in human history, politicians are taking notice of the science. And even the mainstream is waking up to the significance of this. The technologies give us the opportunities. As we look down on our world and think about it and see Italy in its incredible magnificence, the boot of Italy. In this book, I try and draw on the lessons of your country, of what happened here, and think about its implications for today. When Michelangelo unveiled the statue in the square in Florence, you know it created incredible sensation. But why? The story of David and Goliath had been told many times, and when you go around Florence, you see many, many statues of David. But all of those statues have either got David with his sword in Goliath's heart, or his hand holding the severed head of Goliath. None of them show this David. None of them show the David simply thinking, looking to the future, understanding the invincible odds, developing the strategy that he would take responsibility for to master those odds. I find in this the inspiration that we all need. And that's why I believe the Renaissance allows us to rock on to a very happy old age. Grazie mille.